The courtroom was silent. A former police officer sat on the witness stand, eyes darting around nervously. Then the judge entered, and his face drained of color. The woman he once humiliated in open court was now presiding over his fate. This story isn't fiction. It's a chilling dive into the disturbing abuse of power and the shocking twist of fate that put justice back in the hands of the wronged. Years ago, a black woman was humiliated in a courtroom by a white officer with a cruel vendetta. But time and truth have a way of turning the tables. What followed was a high-stakes trial that no one could have predicted. Not even the man who thought he'd silenced her forever. The air inside the courtroom was stale and still, a suffocating silence hanging between the oak walls as the accused was led in. Amira James, 24, a recent college graduate and activist, stood shackled in front of a judge's bench for the first time in her life. Her charge? Obstruction of justice, stemming from a peaceful protest where she had filmed police officers detaining a teenage boy. The charge was thin at best, a smokescreen, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Except Amira wasn't there to be tried. Not really. She was there to be humiliated. Sergeant Dylan Crane stood like a warden from another century. His badge gleamed. His smirk was controlled but unmistakable. He'd arrested Amira 2 nights prior, taking issue with her camera, her attitude, and, though no one dared say it, her blackness. In his mind, she needed to be taught a lesson, not by the book, not through due process, but publicly. As Amira stood before the judge, Crane stepped forward with a clipboard and a calm request that would ignite the courtroom. Your Honor, due to departmental hygiene protocols for detainees entering the holding facility, we request that the defendant's hair be trimmed. Amira blinked, stunned. The judge raised an eyebrow. She's not being incarcerated, the public defender interjected weakly. She's here for arraignment. Crane didn't flinch. Standard policy, Your Honor. Braids can conceal contraband. Clippers are on standby. The room buzzed. Amira opened her mouth to speak, to shout maybe, but the judge nodded curtly. Proceed. It happened fast. 2 bailiffs approached, flanking her like statues, and escorted her to a corner of the courtroom. Her wrists still bound, her voice rising in confusion, she tried to turn away. But then the hum of electric clippers sliced the air. Crane didn't hesitate. He took the clippers in one hand and reached for her head with the other. No, wait. Amira screamed. Her braids, long and thick, fell in clumps. Her scalp burned with each pass, not from the blades, but from the shame. The rage. The helplessness. People in the courtroom watched frozen, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent under the cold rules of law. A few turned away. Most stared. No one stopped him. When it was over, Amira stood with jagged patches on her scalp, strands of hair scattered like broken evidence at her feet. She wasn't crying. Not yet. Her face was a mask of defiance, trembling just slightly at the edges. Clean, Crane said flatly. He tossed the clippers onto a desk, as if this was all routine. She's ready for processing. Case adjourned, the judge said. Gavel fell. Everyone stood, and Amira, humiliated and shorn, was led away in silence. But the cameras had caught it. Not the courtroom's official ones, but those hidden in phones, in the pockets of interns, in the hands of a law clerk who couldn't believe what she was seeing. The footage would later be leaked, but not right away. Someone buried it. Someone with power. No protests erupted. No headlines screamed. Amira was let go 3 days later. No explanation. No apology. The charges were dropped, in the interest of judicial efficiency. But that wasn't justice. She went home with a paper bag of belongings and a shattered sense of identity. Her mirror didn't recognize her. Her phone buzzed with unanswered messages, people asking, "What happened?" And when she explained, when she told them the truth, many didn't believe her. A cop shaved your head? In court? That doesn't happen. It had. And in that moment, Amira learned a truth more harrowing than anything she'd read in textbooks or shouted through megaphones. The system wasn't just flawed, it was capable of cruelty under the guise of procedure. She could have disappeared, could have turned inward, could have burned with hate. But instead, she sat down at her desk, closed her eyes, and remembered Crane's face. She remembered the way he held the clippers like a weapon, the cold satisfaction in his eyes. And she made a vow. I will never be helpless again in a courtroom. Not as a defendant, not as a victim. One day, she would walk into a courtroom with her head held high, not in chains but in robes. And when she did, she would remember everything. The public never saw the tears. They didn't see Amira curled in her mother's arms, head wrapped in a scarf, trembling like a broken branch in the wind. They didn't hear the guttural sobs that clawed their way out of her throat every time she passed a mirror. What the world missed in that courtroom, it also missed in the aftermath. The slow, invisible unraveling of a proud young woman's sense of self. Amira didn't leave her house for 2 weeks. The public defender never returned her calls. The footage, the few clips captured on phones by interns and junior attorneys, vanished. Social media buzzed briefly, then moved on. There were bigger stories to chase, newer outrage to consume. She was a whisper in a storm, forgotten. But trauma doesn't fade. It festers. It weaves itself into memory, into muscle, into every second of silence. Amira would wake up gasping from nightmares, hand clutching the side of her head, expecting to feel the vibration of clippers against her skull. Her doctor diagnosed her with acute PTSD. Her therapist said she needed time. Her family said she needed peace. But peace never came. Instead, something else grew in its place. Resolve. What started as an ember inside her, faint and flickering, began to roar with time. The more she thought of Crane's face, his indifference, his audacity, the stronger the flame became. She wasn't just angry for herself. She was furious for the countless others who never even made it to court, who were erased before their stories ever had a chance to be told. One day, 6 months after the incident, she walked into a salon and sat quietly as a black stylist, older and gentle, trimmed what remained of her hair into a short, natural crown. "You're not broken," the woman said. "You're shedding." It was the first time Amira smiled in months. That same week, she applied to law school. She'd always been passionate about justice. That's why she joined the protest in the first place. But now it wasn't about passion. It was about war. Every page of every textbook became a weapon. She studied like her life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. Amira didn't just excel, she dominated. Professors were stunned by her courtroom analysis, her refusal to be intimidated, her hunger for constitutional nuance. She never told anyone what drove her. She kept her past locked in a vault, sealed behind professional poise and a smile that didn't always reach her eyes. But every time she read a case involving abuse of power, she saw her own reflection in the margins. Every time she argued a hypothetical about police misconduct, she was reliving the moment Crane stood over her with the clippers. By her final year, she had published 3 academic papers on civil rights litigation and was clerking for a federal judge known for his integrity and backbone. In private, she confessed only once, during a late night in chambers, when her mentor asked her why she was so driven. "I was humiliated once," she said simply, "and I promised myself it would never happen again. Not to me, not to anyone." The judge didn't press. He just nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting to hear her say that all along. From there, doors opened, offers poured in. Amira declined them all. Instead, she applied to the state judiciary track. A quieter, less glamorous path, but one with real power, real impact. And all the while, She kept an old photo tucked in the back of her planner. One grainy still frame of that day in court, just before the clippers touched her scalp. Her eyes were wide, terrified, powerless. She kept it not to dwell, but to remember what justice isn't, to remember what justice must be. 7 years after the incident, Amira stood before a mirror again, but this time in a judge's chambers. She adjusted the black robe over her shoulders, looked at her reflection, and nodded once. She had become the very thing she once feared. Not the system, but the counterweight to its cruelty. She was the gavel now, and her hands were steady, but she never imagined what was coming next. She didn't know that fate was circling back with poetic precision. She didn't know that the man who once shaved her head in front of strangers would soon sit in her courtroom, accused of crimes far worse than anyone ever imagined. And she didn't know the nation would soon be watching, because Amira James wasn't just back. She was about to make history. For years, Sergeant Dylan Crane operated under the protective shadow of his badge, untouchable, unquestioned, and unchallenged. To those who worked beside him, he was a model officer. He volunteered for the hardest assignments. He smiled at community events. He even taught de-escalation workshops. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. Calculated, cruel, and emboldened by a system that never held him accountable. His colleagues called it Crane's edge. His ability to push people to the brink and stay just within the lines. If complaints were filed, they vanished in a fog of bureaucracy. If civilians cried abuse, his record of good policing and department praise drowned their voices. But what Crane didn't know, what no officer ever believes until it's too late, was that power borrowed can always be reclaimed. The reckoning began with a file. An anonymous envelope landed on the desk of Internal Affairs, thick with documents and a flash drive. The contents were damning. Internal memos, falsified incident reports, and unedited bodycam footage dating back nearly a decade. On the surface, it seemed like any routine complaint. But it wasn't. The whistleblower was another cop. Detective Carla Ruiz had joined the force the same year as Crane. She'd seen him in action, watched the way he spoke to black men and women with barely disguised contempt. She'd seen him falsify arrests, tamper with evidence, laugh at civilian complaints. And she'd stayed silent. Until now. Inside that file was the footage no one thought still existed. The full video of Amira James' courtroom humiliation. Unlike the snippets that briefly surfaced online and disappeared, this version was high definition, uncut, and included the damning audio of Crane telling a colleague afterward that one won't be marching again anytime soon. The file ignited a storm. Federal investigators were called in. Civil rights organizations mobilized. The Justice Department launched an inquiry into systemic abuse within the department. And at the center of it all stood Dylan Crane. The press got wind of it quickly. At first, Crane dismissed it as a smear campaign. He gave interviews, confidently declaring, "I've always served with honor. These claims are a distortion." He blamed activists. He blamed politics. But the facts refused to bend. More victims came forward. A young man who'd been arrested for resisting while standing still. A pregnant woman forced to the ground for allegedly matching a description. A teenager with autism tossed in front of his mother. Each case bore Crane's signature. A paper trail of brutality wrapped in official justification. Then came the woman from 5 years earlier. An ER nurse, arrested during her lunch break for obstructing a crime scene as she tried to help a bleeding man. Her statement shook prosecutors. "He told me I needed to learn my place," she said. "Then he made sure I couldn't work for months. Broken wrist, bruised ribs. I thought no one would believe me. But now they did." Crane was arrested quietly, escorted from his suburban home in handcuffs, his wife and 2 daughters watching from the porch. He was charged with multiple counts: civil rights violations, falsifying police reports, abuse of authority, and excessive force. The courtroom would become his cage. The same courtroom where he'd once orchestrated others' shame. And yet, he remained confident. His legal team was aggressive, high-profile, expensive. They filed motions, leaked counter-narratives to the media, accused the prosecution of political motivations. Crane carried himself like a man certain of acquittal. "The system's never failed me before," he told one reporter with a smirk. And then came the twist, when the judge's name was finally revealed in the public docket, sealed until just days before the trial. It sent shockwaves through the city. Judge Amira James. Reporters scrambled to verify. Was it the same Amira James from the footage? Could the woman once humiliated in court now sit on the bench to decide the fate of her abuser? The answer was yes. Crane's face reportedly went pale when he saw the assignment. His lawyers filed for her immediate recusal, citing bias. But Judge James responded with a public memorandum that echoed through legal circles. Recusal is warranted when a judge cannot remain impartial. I can. This court is not a stage for revenge. It is a forum for justice. And justice demands that even those who wore the badge be held accountable under the law. The motion was denied. And so, the trial was set. Crane, the once feared officer, now the accused. And James, the once shamed woman, now the law. The city held its breath. Every camera turned to that courtroom. Every citizen waited for what many believed to be the beginning of something bigger than a trial. It was the reckoning of a system. And it was led by a woman who had once stood on the other side of that very bench, powerless, violated and forgotten. Now, the roles were reversed, and the world was watching. Courtroom 7B was packed, every seat filled, every wall lined with reporters, activists, and silent observers who had waited years for justice to catch up to a man like Dylan Crane. Metal detectors clicked constantly as people filed in. News vans choked the courthouse steps. Protesters held signs, accountability, not immunity, justice for the silenced, and one simply, we remember. Crane arrived in a tailored suit, flanked by lawyers who whispered strategy in his ear. He looked older, yes, but still carried himself with that same cold confidence. His lips twitched when the cameras turned his way, a hint of the smirk he once wore in courtrooms like this one. A smirk that said, I own this room. He had no idea what was coming. At 9 a.m. sharp, the clerk announced, all rise for the Honorable Judge Amira James. The courtroom rose as one. All eyes turned to the tall wooden doors at the back of the chamber. Then she entered. Draped in black robes, Judge James stepped forward with measured grace. Her presence was quiet, but thunderous. Her head was held high, natural curls wrapped in a neat, elegant bun, and her face bore no trace of emotion. No anger, no triumph, just control, dignity, power. Crane's eyes found her, and they froze. For the first time, the man who had once stood over her with clippers in hand, mocking, smirking, certain of his supremacy, looked small. For the first time, Dylan Crane saw the full weight of consequence staring back at him. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something. The lawyer stood. Your Honor, he began, we respectfully renew our motion for recusal. Due to prior personal interactions, we believe an impartial trial is. Judge James raised her hand gently, silencing the room without a word. I have ruled on this matter, she said, her voice calm but ironclad. And unless new evidence has emerged regarding my ability to uphold the law, this court will proceed. The lawyer hesitated, then sat down. Amira turned to the jury pool. Let's begin voir dire. And with that, the trial was underway. Every moment felt like history being written. Social media exploded. Journalists live-tweeted every second. Legal scholars debated the ethics of her presence on the bench. Some called it inappropriate. Others called it poetic, but no one could deny the magnitude of what was unfolding. Each day, Amira presided with surgical precision. She ruled firmly, fairly, and without favoritism. She allowed the defense to cross-examine witnesses aggressively. She sustained objections when warranted. She refused to let personal history cloud legal integrity. And yet, the irony of it all hovered above every word like storm clouds waiting to burst. The prosecution presented a damning case. They laid out Crane's pattern of abuse. Reports buried, evidence manipulated, victims silenced. And always at the center of it was the same chilling theme: control through humiliation. It was Amira's story, magnified. But she never flinched. Even when they played the footage, that footage, in open court, the uncut video from the day Crane shaved her head, the gasps rippled through the room as the image of a young, trembling Amira appeared on the screen. Crane stood behind her, clippers buzzing, face calm and expressionless as hair fell in clumps to the floor. Crane didn't look up. His hands clenched, his jaw tightened. But Amira? She didn't blink. She watched herself be degraded. She listened to the courtroom's silence. She heard her own screams, raw, desperate, echoing through time. Then she looked forward again and continued the session, her gavel striking like thunder. Order maintained, emotion contained. That moment became legend. By the end of the third week, Crane was unraveling. His smirk had faded. He snapped at his lawyers, shifted nervously in his seat, avoided Amira's eyes. Then came the bombshell. A former officer, now retired and terminally ill, testified under oath that Crane had joked about breaking that loud girl with a camera during a poker night. He said she needed to be shown what happens when you mess with the law. The man testified. Said he wanted her to look in the mirror and see defeat. That sealed it. The courtroom was dead silent. Jurors stiffened. Reporters stopped typing. Crane looked like he might be sick. But Judge Amira James remained still. No gloating. No reaction. Only law. As the trial neared its end, it became clear that this wasn't just about Crane anymore. It was about a system reckoning with itself. About whether the robe could stand above the pain. Whether someone who had been stripped of dignity could still deliver justice with honor. And Amira? She proved that justice isn't about vengeance. It's about power, reclaimed, not abused. As closing arguments ended, and the jury left to deliberate, all eyes turned once more to the woman on the bench. And in that moment, she wasn't just Judge James. She was a symbol of survival, of strength, of justice not delayed, but delivered. The jury had been out for nearly 6 hours. Inside the courtroom, tension coiled like a spring ready to snap. Reporters whispered updates. Family members of Crane's victims held hands, prayed, stared at the floor. The bailiff's face was blank, but his fingers tapped anxiously on the edge of the podium. At the center of it all sat Dylan Crane. Suit rumpled now, tie loosened, hands trembling ever so slightly. For the first time in years, he had no badge, no uniform, no department to shield him. Only the weight of his past, crashing down like waves. And above him, behind the bench, sat the woman he once tried to break. Judge Amira James. In the final moments of the trial, the defense had pulled out every card. Character witnesses, departmental commendations, even attempts to frame his misconduct as misinterpreted policy. But the truth had already taken root in the courtroom. It had been watered by testimony, nurtured by evidence, and fed by every cruel, callous word Crane had uttered in the name of the law. The most anticipated moment of the trial, however, wasn't delivered by a lawyer or a prosecutor. It came when Amira exercised her authority to allow a rare but legal moment in state court. A direct judicial question to the defendant, not as a cross-examination, but a procedural clarification during testimony. "Mr. Crane," she asked, voice measured, hands folded neatly on the bench. "Do you remember the date June 18th, 8 years ago?" Crane shifted in his seat. I don't recall specific dates. You escorted a detainee into a courtroom and personally shaved her head. Do you remember that?" His lawyer stood. "Objection, Your Honor." Amira raised her hand calmly. "This is not cross-examination. This is a judicial inquiry related to the admissibility of prior conduct already entered into evidence. The witness will answer." Crane's lips parted. His throat bobbed. "Yes," he said finally. "I remember." "Why did you do it?" He hesitated. "It was policy." "No," Amira said, her tone still calm, yet suddenly sharp with surgical precision. "There was no written directive authorizing on-site hair removal by arresting officers. No health code violation. No smuggled contraband. So again, Mr. Crane, why did you do it?" Crane opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Not justification, not apology, not denial, just silence. And in that silence, the courtroom heard the truth louder than any testimony. The next morning, the jury returned. 12 men and women entered solemnly, eyes focused forward. The foreperson handed a slip to the clerk, who passed it to Judge James. She read it silently. No change in expression. Then she nodded. "In the matter of the State versus Dylan Crane, on the charges of abuse of authority, tampering with official records, and civil rights violations," she said, "how does the jury find?" The foreperson stood. "Guilty. On all counts." A wave of quiet sobs broke out in the gallery. A woman clutched her mouth in disbelief. Someone whispered, "Finally." Crane sat motionless. No outburst, no defiance, just a hollow stare at the desk in front of him. The man who once commanded a courtroom through intimidation now looked like he didn't know where he was. But it wasn't over yet. Sentencing was left to Judge James. A rare but permitted decision in this type of trial. All eyes turned to her as she prepared to speak. The verdict: a judge's reckoning. Amira James removed her reading glasses, folded her hands, and took a breath. When she spoke, her voice was even, but carried a depth that reached every soul in the courtroom. "Mr. Crane," she began, "you wore the badge not as a symbol of service, but as a shield for cruelty. You used the law not to protect, but to punish, not with purpose, but with pride." She paused, looking directly at him now. 8 years ago, you walked into a courtroom and tried to strip a young woman of her dignity. You believed that by cutting her hair, you could silence her, control her, reduce her to nothing. But you misunderstood the power of humiliation. You didn't break her. You ignited her. Her voice tightened. "You left that courtroom thinking you'd won. But I walked out of that room that day with fire in my blood. Not hate, purpose. Because I knew the only way to dismantle injustice was from within." She stood now, robes billowing slightly. "You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in a federal correctional facility. No parole, no probation. You will serve each day not as a man above the law, but as one held to its highest standard." The gavel struck once. "This court is adjourned." Gasps, applause, tears. The room erupted. As Crane was led away in handcuffs, for once, no one looked at him. They were all looking at her. Judge Amira James. Not the victim, not the activist, not the girl they once tried to humiliate, but the woman who turned pain into justice and proved that dignity, when reclaimed, is more powerful than vengeance ever could be.